Hi everybody, Adam Steele here, and today's video is about compressors, but specifically diode bridge compressors. Not the most well-used type of compressor. So today we're going to talk about what that is, what it does, and two completely different ones, including a brand new one from my friend Bart Herc. So let's check them out after the intro. So typical housekeeping at the start of the video, do please press the like button, it really helps. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. All that kind of stuff, you know, I'm not going to dwell on that too long. But compression, when we're talking about actual hardware compressors, there are not that many different types of compression. Yes, there are thousands of different compressors out there, but they all have to rely on a method of some kind. Some of the most well-known ones are FET compressors, like the 1176 is one of the most well-known. VCA compressors, like SSL's bus compressor is a well-known one of those. Optical compressors, like the LA2A and LA3A, those are well-known. And then there's the Diode Bridge Compressor. And they seem to be fairly rare, and I don't really know why. Now, the most well-known diode bridge compressor, as far as I can tell, is the Neve 2254. Or in stereo, when you put them in a unit, the 33609 is the name for that stereo unit there. And this down here is a faithful recreation of the Neve 33609. This is from Stam Audio, and this is loaned from my friend John Brown from Monuments. He's on tour at the moment, so I've nicked this out of his mastering setup. I've done a video on that before if you want to check that out, but that is a very faithful replication of the Neve design. Now, because those are the only ones that I was aware of and the only diode bridge compressors that I had used, I thought that diode bridge compressors had a relatively fast attack but quite a slow release with kind of a pumping kind of artifact about it, which I personally am not a big fan of. It's nice. It's not the kind of thing I gravitate towards. And the way that it works is exactly as described diodes, which only let sound go one way and not the other. Well, they only let electricity go one way and not the other. And we're putting sound signals through that. There is some circuitry which I'm not technical enough to understand, which is the detector circuit, which is what works out when the level should be compressed and then when to release it. And that's the same for every type of compressor, but that's the main difference that I know of that determines how a compressor feels and partly can determine what sources it becomes appropriate on. Now, I always thought that diode bridge compressors had this kind of slow, squishy release, kind of like an optical compressor. It turns out from talking to Bart Herc, who's made these brand new devices, the CP554, which are a 500 series unit, which is why they're in this kind of setup here. It turns out diode bridge compression is really, really fast if you want it to be. So it's all in the design. So that's where I'm kind of focusing this video today, on these new 554 units. It's not strictly a review, it's kind of a bit of a deep dive because Bart Herc has sent me these and some other pieces of equipment that you can see in this 500 rack here. So it wouldn't be fair for me to call this a review. It is kind of not exactly impartial, but I'm going to dive into these units compared to a more faithful recreation of the diode bridge everybody knows, and see what the differences are, see what the sound is like. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get a full mix that's ready to go that I did for the Audient SP8 video very recently. And I'm going to run that through the Herc units and the Stam unit. They're both stereo linked. The Herc units are stereo linked internally inside the 500 series. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And so I've got them set. Let's have a look. I've got them set at 3:1 compression. They're matched as much as possible, so the Herc units are in vintage mode, which emulates the sound of that big saturation transformer-y thing. The Stam unit actually has the faithful transformers in. The makeup gain on these is to match to go back so that they sound the same level, and the recovery time, so the release, is as fast as it'll go on the Stam, so 100 milliseconds, and it's set to match at 100 milliseconds on the Herc units, but they can go faster. But this is trying to be a like-to-like comparison. We'll get to playing with the controls in a little while. The input threshold on both is relatively high, but that's because the mix is coming out fairly loud, so we don't need much makeup gain. There is a limiter section on the 33609, and that is not enabled because that's a whole separate thing and isn't something that I'm going to focus on today. That's a separate part of the circuitry. So here's an AB. So you can hear they both sound great. The Stam unit, which is, again, very close to the Neve unit, has that slightly squishy compression thing, which probably works really well on slower material, less rocky stuff. I know that John Brown swears by this on everything that he produces, but I preferred the Herc units because they had a little bit more of a snappy response, a bit less of the, what's the word? A bit less of that obvious compression. It's a personal taste thing. I don't like the sound of obvious compression. I'm also going to run a vocal through them both now, and I'm going to put that to, I think, 4:1. Does this do 4:1? So I'm going to set them both to 4:1, which is the same ratio that I would use in 1176 on a vocal, and I'm going to use these in vintage mode again, but I'm going to have to set these appropriately to get the threshold so that I'm really hitting these quite hard and try and match them as best I can.
Feeling the indoctrinated sound. Do you know that feeling? 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 The indoctrinated sound.
So we could hear that they sound very similar on kind of a medium level vocal, and then as the vocal got louder and more aggressive, the 33609 seemed to clamp down and squish a bit more, where the Herc ones kind of were a bit more lively, which again is my preference. That's why I tend to go with things like 1176s on vocals, because the liveliness is a thing that I like. Now, again, focusing on the Herc ones, because that was what prompted me to make this video. That Bart sent me these and said, "Hey, I'm releasing this soon. Would you mind talking about it?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure." And so, yeah, there's this thing called vintage mode, which you don't need to use, but it puts in a transformer style thing that Bart calls an active transformer, which is a very clever way that he's made that I'm fascinated by, and I want to know more about how he's got the sound of transformers incorporated into the sound without having to use a big lump of iron. Because of course the Stam one, if you look inside, has, I think it's either 4 or 6 big chunks of iron, massive transformers that add a big weight to the sound. But originally in all the old Neve stuff, that wasn't why the Transformers were there. There are interviews with Rupert Neve going on record saying that the reason that he used loads of Transformers in everything was because in the 60s and early 70s, that was still the most effective way to keep the noise floor really low and properly electrically isolate everything. So it was a very practical consideration at the time, and the added benefit was that there was this added kind of richness to the sound, which now, 50 years later, that's the thing we focus on, is that it's like we really liked how the harmonics would saturate a little bit in a certain way that would give things a certain thickness and richness to our ears without being just all out distortion. So what he's done is he's gone, right, well, if we like that sound, let's get that sound without having to build and buy and install massive transformers, which are expensive. And this is where we start to diverge with design philosophies, because Josh Stam and his team have gone down the route of really faithful recreations. They get the sound by making things exact, because if you can make an exact version of something, that's gonna get the sound. And I completely appreciate that. Whereas Bart has gone the other way and gone, well, we like the sound, let's make it a whole new way, which I really quite appreciate. Now, some of you might already be saying, well, who is this guy? I'm sure he doesn't know what he's talking about. This can't be anything. It's a cheap knockoff. Let me tell you for a second who Bart Herc is. He's a designer who used to work for Neve and also used to work for Focusrite. The reissue of the Neve 2264 Diode Bridge Compressor was done by Bart Herc, the man who made these. So he literally made not the 2254 but the 2264 reissue, which is a diode bridge compressor for Neve. So he knows how to make a diode bridge, which is why these are about as close as you're going to get to the way that the Neve stuff is without the massive cost. And that's a big thing for me, because I'm looking to get amazing sounds out of hardware without paying huge amounts of money. I know that there are people who will kind of, buy the best of the best regardless of price tag and will get results from it. That's amazing. I mean, Stam Audio, this thing is incredible. It really is. And Josh Stam and his team are sending me some stuff over right now to make a whole different video with. They make amazing equipment, but this costs at UK retail £3,500. At least the Neve one does. I think the Stam one might be less. Let me look. Okay, so the Neve one's £3,500. The Stam one after import's probably more like $2,000 because it was $2,000 at stock price. So that's still a lot of money. So that's kind of £2,000. A pair of these is currently, I think he said, about £650. Now, you do have to have a 500 series unit that can power everything. This was £200. So if I don't count any of the rest of this stuff, I'd be looking at 800 quid for these two and the unit, compared to £2,000 for that. And they are different. If you look at the nice little B-roll I'm doing of the Diode Bridge compressors right now, they don't have the big fat chunks of iron on, but they've made it in a design in such a way that it gets a very similar kind of sound, using the same diode bridge technology to get that kind of thing. And it's got features that are really relevant to me, like variable control instead of stepped pots. It's got more choices for attack time, where the other one is either slow or fast. It's got more choices for recovery time, completely expanded ratios, all that kind of stuff that's makes it more versatile. And the killer feature for me is that it's got these high-pass filter buttons for 150 Hz, which take the low end out of the compression detection circuit, which means if you're using these on a master bus and it's got quite a sub-heavy kind of thing, the Stam one or the Neve one is going to do lots of ducking with lots of sub stuff, and the Herc ones aren't, if you engage those buttons, because that is exactly what you would want. I know that Stam have done a very similar feature on one of their SSL style compressors, the Mark II version, and they're probably planning on doing it on other stuff. It's a very relevant feature, I think, now that never used to be needed, where a lot of music now is very sub-heavy because of the digital kind of era that we live in. We don't have to worry about sub stuff, so a lot of masters have lots of low end in. And yeah, if you don't want them to start kind of sucking and pumping, that's how you do that. Now, I did ask Bart Herc if he could make a version of this with a wet dry knob on. Maybe we'll see that in the future. But yeah, the fact that these are quite affordable and can be done in such a tiny, tiny unit compared to the big 2U monster mean that it's really something that I would consider buying more of. Again, I've been sent these, so I can't really call this a review. It's not completely impartial, full disclosure. I love what Josh Stam does. I love what Bart Herc does. They are very different things for very different people. But yeah, both worth checking out if you're bored of the 1176, LA2A, and SSL bus compressor kind of, FET opto and VCA options. Diode Bridge could be where it's at. So there we go. I hope you got something interesting out of my ramblings here. If you want to learn more about different types of compressors, you can check out my Audio Essentials course where I talk about EQ, compression and delay on ProMix Academy. That's super in depth about all this kind of stuff. And you can support us on Patreon, that really helps, or you could just hit like and subscribe, that helps too. Thanks everybody, I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.